A school or B school? By that we mean, where can business people learn the most useful and applicable knowledge? In Austrian school economics or from business school content? Let's find out from Peter Klein.
This is the Economics for Entrepreneurs podcast. Entrepreneurs are champions for customers, improving their lives with preferred products and services, value, and innovation. We offer you the knowledge and tools to make your entrepreneurial journey a successful one by building a beautiful business. Now, here's your host, Hunter Hastings.
Hi, Hunter Hastings here. A school or B school? Our proposition here is that A school gives you more. By that we mean that studying Austrian economics and learning and absorbing some of its key principles will provide more usable and applicable knowledge, more business understanding, and more useful processual visual models. We'll touch on a number of elements of A school superiority today. Let me highlight just a few in advance. We'll touch on humanism. Austrian economics is, as Mark Schaefer told us in episode 52, the future of marketing because it's more human. The future of business is more Austrian for the same reason. Human understanding extends to serving customers through understanding their subjective reasons for experiencing value. An Austrian business lens helps you understand perception, interaction, and community building. It helps you understand the emotion in decision-making. Data is useful, but ultimately humans decide subjectively how to balance risk and opportunity in choosing a course of action. The same Austrian humanism applies to hiring and managing employees, understanding them as people rather than as resources or means. Part of the secret is Austrian individualism, starting analysis at the individual level, because only individuals decide. This understanding embraces the other directedness of individuals. They care for family and friends, and they like to work together in teams. But Austrianism avoids false generalities or collectives, like, for example, a loose concept such as corporate culture. That's just a term for applying individual behavioral analysis to a corporate context. Individuals are always the analytical starting point. Another Austrian insight I'll highlight is the role of entrepreneurial imagination. That's really hard for business schools to teach because it doesn't fit well with the engineering approach to fine-tuning the business machine that is the firm. Austrians understand that it is the way that entrepreneurs imagine the future, aided and guided by the empathy they have for their future customers, that makes them fundamentally creative actors, and creativity knows no bounds. One more element I will spotlight before we proceed. Austrian economics makes business more straightforward. It doesn't invite you to overanalyze. Choose your customers, identify what problem you'd like to solve for them through empathy, imagine the solution, assemble the combination of resources most likely to bring it to market at the right price and right cost, test, and expand. There are an infinite number of possibilities, and the entrepreneur chooses the most likely one for him or her. It's an exciting, action-oriented view of business. Today's guest is an old friend, Peter Klein. Peter is the Carl Menger Research Fellow of the Mises Institute and Professor of Entrepreneurship at Baylor University's Hankamer School of Business, as well as Senior Research Fellow at the Bohr Center for Entrepreneurship and Free Enterprise. His research focuses on the economics of entrepreneurship and business organization, and so he's the perfect guide for us today. Peter, welcome again to Economics for Entrepreneurs.
Thanks, Hunter. It's so great to be with you again.
Well, thank you. We've been, as you know, comparing on the podcast and elsewhere what we think businesses can learn from the Austrian School of Economics and differentiating that in our own way from business school. And as I always say, we're not trying to criticize the business schools, but just trying to look at the kind of a business paradigm that can emerge from Austrian economics and your knowledge of Austrian economics, which we think is new and better. We had Dr. Byland on episode number 90, where we built out the pillars of such a paradigm. And that's very consistent with the conversation you and I had on episode 40. You talked about the 10 principles of Austrian economics that are most applicable for entrepreneurial business. And you started an interesting place, Peter. You talked about humanism, that economics, especially economics for business, is not about numbers and aggregates and indexes and charts. It's about people and their choices and their hopes and their dreams. So help our business audience how they might think about humanism.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start because business education, business research, the practice of business is right. I mean, it sounds cliched and trite to say, well, we're all about people, how people interact, how people think, how people behave under different conditions. But of course, that is exactly what we're all about. Um, business studies is based on economics and also psychology, sociology, and so forth. But we're really part of that broad social science tradition. So while for entrepreneurs, especially in particular industries, natural and physical phenomena are important. So in many lines of business, and almost all lines of business, right, entrepreneurs need to be concerned with the physical world or the natural world. We care about physics and engineering. We care about the natural environment, the climate, the weather, and so forth. But ultimately, what business is about, right, is relationships among people. So it's not just those physical attributes by themselves that matter. It's how those physical attributes are perceived by entrepreneurs, by consumers, by lenders, by workers, and so forth. So to me, business is an extremely humanistic discipline in the sense that, it's about the individual and the individual's beliefs and perceptions. It's about how we interact, how we form communities, and so forth. So, it's not just about the numbers. It's not just about indexes and charts and diagrams and aggregates, though those things can be useful for trying to apprehend the world around us. But it's really this idea that individual human beings and how they perceive the world and act in the world, right? That's really what the study of business is all about.
Yeah, and I used to be focused very much on the marketing function in business, and that's where you understand that what we used to call emotional benefits, how people feel about their interactions with businesses and brands, are the most important motivators. You got to get that right in business. It's hard to measure, it's hard to put on a chart, but it's the goal that you're aiming for is the feeling of an emotional benefit.
I think that's right. And, it can be emotional. It could also be more sort of, quote unquote, rational. But the point is, it's about how we think about the world, not how the world sort of affects us independent of our thinking and our senses and so on. If I could draw an analogy, Hunter, like I'm sure everybody else, we're doing this recording in November of 2020. I've been paying a lot of attention over the last few months to what we hear about diseases from epidemiologists and other scientists who specialize in the biological characteristics of viruses and how viruses are transmitted and so forth. But you've probably noticed, a lot of our listeners have noticed, you can pick up a bit of tension in the discussions that people have about the COVID-19 situation and what we should do about it. A tension between some scientists, epidemiologists, and other scientists as well, who seem to draw from their own scientific expertise on how viruses behave, sort of the added idea that we ought to be making decisions about our society, whether to open or close the schools, whether to allow businesses to run, what kinds of rules should be in place for wearing masks or social distancing, and so forth. Sometimes there's been a little bit of pushback, I think, against the idea that, well, we should put the scientists in charge, right? Those of us who are not trained scientists, epidemiologists, or virologists, we should really just not participate in that conversation. We should listen to the science and do what the science tells us. I mean, the problem with that, as many have pointed out, is that science is not an oracle that speaks and tells us what to do, right? The science provides very useful information. It provides data. It proposes theoretical mechanisms and so forth. but the ultimate decisions about what we as individuals, as families, as societies, communities, what we do to reduce the potential harm from COVID-19 while at the same time balancing other considerations. Those are decisions that human beings make. Those are social, political, humanistic decisions, not quantitative scientific decisions. It's ultimately up to us as human beings, to figure out how to balance alternative risks and figure out what is the most prudent course of action. Again, that's what the entrepreneur does. The entrepreneur makes use of data that are available, but the entrepreneur ultimately has to interpret that data and come to some decision using subjective understanding, judgment, and so forth.
And the Austrian approach of what we call methodological individualism, that sounds highly academic, but it's about studying individuals and how they make decisions, and then, as you said, how that relates to larger systems, how social systems are built on those individual decisions. That seems to be an aspect that we can perhaps bring to that discussion that is distinctive. And it's interesting to note that some areas of scientific investigation are going in that direction. When you look at complex systems theory, it builds up from individual agents and figures out how they react with each other and with artifacts and with the ecology of society and so on. So maybe the individualism of Austrian economics is in line with the way we should be thinking today.
Oh, I think you're exactly right. For years, critics of the Austrian approach to economics, critics of economics in general, critics of this way of thinking have sort of caricatured this Austrian position as saying, well, Austrians believe in atomistic individualism as a sort of philosophy or as a kind of normative creed. It's all about you and yourself, and you shouldn't take other people into consideration and so forth. That's, of course, a complete canard, right? That is not at all what Austrian methodological individualism says. It merely claims that, to understand how people act, how people think, how people behave, we need to start with the level of the individual. In other words, individuals can be other directed, right? I can care primarily about my family. I can care more about my company than my own well-being. I can care about my community and my neighbors and so forth. But if we're asking, how do I decide what products to make or sell, how to market my products, whom to hire and how to operate my business, right? We've got to get inside the mind of the individual or the individuals, plural, who are making that decision. We can't just assume that, the firm is acting. A lot of people in business, we like to talk about these group level constructs like corporate culture and firm level competencies and capabilities. And those are fine as kind of abstractions. But what the Austrian school says is, corporate culture is not the cause of some, it doesn't explain why one firm is more successful than another. Corporate culture is a label that we apply to the behaviors and attitudes and norms and practices of individuals within organizations. So we Austrians are all about community, all about interaction. But we say that to sort of explain outcomes, methodologically, we need to start with individual beliefs, individual preferences, how individuals, what they think about the future, the values that they hold, whether they're customers or entrepreneurs or workers, and use that as the starting point, not the ending point, but the starting point for our analysis and explanation.
And it seems to me that the digital world, the technological world is moving in that direction. I should say moving in enabling that direction. We can now personalize interactions through digital tools and digital models. We can collect data at a very fine-grained level. We can analyze it at that same fine-grained level. So technology is becoming Austrian. It's becoming individualized, right?
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's always been the case that the individual consumer makes the ultimate decision about whether he or she will purchase or not. But it used to be much more difficult to tailor the options to specific customers. You could You could have any color of Model T Ford you wanted as long as it was black. You can go into Walmart and, there's lots of different kinds of toothpaste available on the shelf, many more than would have been available in earlier eras. But still, you may have 10 toothpastes from which to choose. You make that choice. But if there's some other more obscure kind of toothpaste that's not available in your local area, well, you've got to make a choice among those options that are available to you. Nowadays, with online commerce and quick and inexpensive shipping around the world for physical products, and of course with digital products that are delivered costlessly, through the internet, it's possible to fine tune and segment and tailor products and services to the very, very specific needs of individual consumers. I mean, that's a way that I guess I would say technology has facilitated a kind of fine-grained individual action and interaction that wasn't possible before these wonderful breakthrough innovations.
A quick note, did you know that we provide supplemental materials for each podcast? Listening to and understanding the key takeaways from our expert guests helps you think better about building a more beautiful business. Taking direct action and implementing these strategies is when the real work begins. Take a concrete, immediate step to implementing a better business model today by downloading the show notes and business tool we've created for this episode. Visit Mises.org/E4EPod. That's MISES.org/E4EPOD and click on today's episode. Now, back to our interview.
And another humanistic business tool, Peter, that you have certainly been associated with developing and stressing is the use of imagination for entrepreneurs. It's a counterfactual way of thinking, as our friend Mark Packard always says, but it's kind of contradictory to at least on the surface, to the business school approach of identifying a market and calculating in a very scientific manner how you get there. You talk about opportunities don't exist, entrepreneurs imagine them. So tell us more about that, because that seems like it's part of the humanism of economics.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the way I use a term like imagination, I'm not thinking of kind of the everyday sense of people who are very creative daydreamers. I really just mean that the future doesn't exist before we bring it into being. So from the point of view of today, I have to imagine possible futures. I don't know exactly what the future is going to look like. Now, I may be able to apply some decision rules or heuristics, right? I can do scenario analysis. Well, I don't know exactly what's going to happen tomorrow, next week, next year, but I think the three most likely scenarios are A, B, and C. And here's what I think would happen in each of those scenarios. And here's what I think would happen to me or to our company or to our community under these different scenarios. And we think that, well, probably, we want to try to bring about scenario B, or we think that scenario C is most likely, and we need to take that into consideration. I'm not opposed in any way to decision makers using whatever analytical tools they may find useful. And of course, that could be quantitative forecasting, but it could also be intuition, it could be gut instinct, it could be a very subjective and tacit kind of understanding. But the point is, it's incumbent upon decision makers to imagine possible futures and to try to act to bring about the futures that they prefer. The future doesn't exist already. Opportunities aren't out there objectively waiting for people to discover them. Rather, we have to act under conditions of uncertainty, not knowing for sure what will happen, but doing our best to get the outcome that we desire.
Well, I love the way that you teach imagination, because it seems to me like a very empowering idea for anybody in business, anybody who's in an entrepreneurial situation or running an innovation project or working on organizational redesign, that everybody is empowered to imagine the future, and then you try and gather more information and move that project along and get it closer to your imagination. Maybe your imagination is wrong, you got to change it. But the empowerment of imagination seems quite inspiring to me.
Yeah, that's right. I agree. And we normally think of it, we think of this concept, in conditions of very high novelty and creativity. The famous idea attributed to Steve Jobs, that, well, there's no point in doing market analysis because the market for our products doesn't exist, right? The customer doesn't know that they will want this thing until I show it to them. And that certainly is one manifestation of the kind of imagination and creativity that we're talking about. But I just want to emphasize, you don't have to have a Steve Jobs kind of personality to engage in imagination, right? To imagine, we all have to imagine what will happen as we consider different options. And we're all creative in the sense that we create, right? Now, the thing that you create or I create may not dazzle the world the way the first iPhone did, or the way that, a Picasso canvas might dazzle the world. But human beings are fundamentally creative actors. Entrepreneurs are bringing new products and services and firms and exchange relationships into being. So entrepreneurship is inherently an imaginative and a creative activity just by its very nature.
And then you develop, Peter, a mechanism to get from imagination to results. You called it BAR, belief, action, and then results, which is a little different than the traditional way of looking at building a business plan and a process chart, that you turn your imagination into beliefs. I believe this is possible, or I believe this could happen. Let me act, in Austrian terms, let me do something, and then you get results, and then you adapt appropriately. So BAR is different than planning, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it would. I mean, it would incorporate planning, but the idea is, I can plan all I want. I can do all the scenario analysis I want. I can look at forecasts. I can sit in a room with the doors and windows closed and just imagine in my head. I can do all of those things, right? But entrepreneurship is a form of action, right? We're interested in what entrepreneurs do, not just what they think. And of course, what they do is the result of what they think, right? So what some of my colleagues and I would describe as the entrepreneurial process is, it has a linear aspect to it, though it's also recursive and different things can be going on at the same time. But the idea is, before the entrepreneur acts, the entrepreneur has some beliefs or expectations or imaginations about, what is the point of acting? Why would I want to take that action? Well, it will bring about a state of affairs that I prefer to the state of affairs that would occur if I don't act. That's the way Mises characterized human action, right? So I have some beliefs about the present, beliefs about the future, beliefs about my ability to bring about a preferred future. And on the basis of those beliefs, I act. And by the way, acting could also include deciding not to start a firm, or not to take the plunge, or not to pivot, or not to introduce the new product or whatever. But I take some action in the real world as part of my entrepreneurial, as part of the entrepreneurial process. And then, as you said, there are some results that come out of that action, right? My product is wildly successful and I earn lots of profits, or my product is unsuccessful and I have to eat a huge loss, or my venture grows or it doesn't grow or whatever. As a result, viewing and interpreting those results, right? Then I have to decide, well, what's my next action going to be? That affects my beliefs for the subsequent round, for the next round of acting. And really what I'm trying to get at with this idea of beliefs, actions, and results is that, there are both subjective and objective features that come into play. There's a long debate in the academic entrepreneurship literature about whether opportunities exist objectively or whether opportunities are subjectively created by entrepreneurs. I like to get away from the concept of opportunity because I think there's a lot that's sort of smuggled into the notion of opportunity that I think can be misleading. But what I mean is action depends on the entrepreneur's subjective beliefs about what will happen when he or she acts, but objective reality comes into play with the results. right? I can imagine that I'm, a wildly successful businessman as much as I want, and I could take all kinds of actions in the marketplace and still completely flop, right? So I cannot bring about an objective state of the world through my imagination and guarantee that I get the one I want, right? As to use a baseball metaphor, reality bats last.
Mm-hmm.
And reality may decide that my beliefs were wrong, in which case I either need to adjust them and try again, or I need to decide that, being an entrepreneur is not for me. But this is just a very simple way of saying subjective values, subjective beliefs matter, but it's not just about that. It's also about acting in the real world and seeing what happens.
But that seems to me like it would change the way that entrepreneurs go to market. You look at things like the lean business canvas, which has become very popular.
Right.
It's quite complex. There are 11 or 13 boxes you have to fill in. And as our friend Kurt Carlson, who talks about innovation with us, he said, nobody thinks like that.
Right.
And whereas BAR, people can think like this. Hey, I believe this, I'm going to do this, and I'll see what happens. That seems to me, again, very different way to approach business.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's much more straightforward. It's more commonsensical. This is the way that business people actually talk. They don't really use, they don't use the kind of thinking that we associate with different kinds of business models, different kinds of business model canvases and so forth. Again, if someone finds those kind of techniques useful as a sort of heuristic device, I would never say, oh, no, you mustn't use it. But yeah, I think it's a little bit of an artificial way of trying to characterize a process that is, in fact, much more natural for us as human beings. I mean, this is what we do even when we wake up in the morning. We have beliefs about what's going to happen that day. And as a result, we decide what to wear and where to go and what to do. And then at the end of the day, we look at the results and decide if we're satisfied or not, and maybe make different decisions the next day.
Yeah, I believe this cup of coffee will make me feel better.
Right.
You mentioned uncertainty already, and we talk about it endlessly on this podcast because it's so important. But one of the elements that I read about in the Gallup Strengths Finder for entrepreneurs is that entrepreneurs embrace uncertainty. They see it as a place to use their imagination to imagine a better future, whereas often in business we're told to reduce uncertainty before we act. Do you have a point of view about that idea of embracing uncertainty? Is that something an entrepreneur can do?
Yeah, I mean, I would put it this way: as an individual decision maker, would I be better off if I had some inside knowledge that, when I take a certain action, I can almost guarantee that a particular result will obtain? I mean, sure, that'd be great for me as a business person, but imagine that carries through to everybody, right? Without uncertainty, how am I going to make any money? If everybody knows exactly what's going to happen tomorrow, then everybody would be competing for the same customers, would be building the same product, would be marketing it in exactly the same way. The fact that there is uncertainty, and that therefore consumers, entrepreneurs, other stakeholders all have differences of opinion on what's going to work and what's not going to work and what's going to happen. That's what makes successful entrepreneurial action possible. Right. So uncertainty in the environment is good for me as an entrepreneur because it means that there are possibilities of me achieving the kinds of successes that I want. Absent uncertainty, what a boring world that would be, right? And how would it be possible for me to innovate, to be creative, and to be successful, whether financially successful or otherwise? So I think we have we humans have a complex and nuanced relationship with uncertainty. At the individual level, we don't like it, but we like the fact that not everybody knows what we know, or rather what we think we know.
Right. That's a great way to put it. So we were going to talk, Peter, about another core building block of the business school curriculum, which is case studies, and how not those might be helpful to entrepreneurs. We have a favorite story here, which is the case study of the Honda 50 motorcycle. And it goes something like this, that Honda had a great success in Asia with its little 50cc motorcycle. It was super popular and very profitable. And they decided to bring it to America where there was a big market. And everybody said, you can't possibly succeed against the 500cc Harley Davidsons that Americans like, and so on. And after several years, the Honda 50 became very popular and very successful, and they got a big share of the motorcycle market. And there are two case studies extant. And one says, this is a great example of brilliant planning, of approaching a market and finding a niche and building up a distribution base and all of those things. And another case study by an equally prestigious business school, it said, these people had no idea what they were doing. And there was a lot of serendipity and failures and errors, and it just kind of happened. And we look back at it, it was just luck. And I use that story to say, hey, case studies are a bit dangerous because they're subjective in how you interpret them, and they can't help you very much. So with that as a preamble, how should we think about case studies as a method for business to learn?
Yeah, it's a great question. As business schools emerged and became more specialized and professionalized in the latter half of the 20th century, the case method became ensconced as the sort of most popular way to teach business principles. The Harvard Business School, Harvard is, of course, the biggest producer of business cases. People talk about the Harvard method or the Harvard case method. My sense is, I don't have hard data to back this up. I've been doing this for more than 20 years, and I think there's a little bit less emphasis placed on the case method today than there used to be in years past. But cases are still very popular for teaching business concepts, especially in fields like strategy and even in entrepreneurship. I think Austrian economists have a very sensible way of thinking about cases. And it's very similar to, and indeed based on, the way that the great theorists of the Austrian school, like Ludwig von Mises and F.A. Hayek and so forth, the way they viewed the relationship between theory and data, or theory and history, as Mises titled one of his books. And, the Austrians believe that we can derive certain theoretical propositions from just sort of thinking carefully about them, and through logical reflection, we can arrive at some basic principles. But then, of course, how we apply them to specific cases, to specific circumstances in the real world, is an entirely different process. It's one that requires a lot of skill. It's an art rather than a science. It requires deep familiarity with the local circumstances, with the data on the ground. So in other words, if we want to explain, what were the origins of the Second World War, theory alone is not going to provide an answer for that question. Yet at the same time, the Austrians also argued, it's not like you can study 50 or 100 world wars and then from that induce some general principles, inductively come up with some general theory from studying multiple cases, because every case is so different. Mm-hmm. Right? It's not like we can replay World War II over and over again. I've been having this conversation with some friends about the forecast for the U.S. presidential election. There's a lot of, there's certainly betting sites, and there are these predictive models like Nate Silver's famous 538 group. And it's funny, if you look at like the 538 website, or if you looked at it before the election, when they say, Biden has, I don't know what they said before the election, 65% chance of winning, and Trump has a 30% chance of winning, whatever it was. They actually have a diagram where they show like little bubbles where each bubble represents a different run of their model. We ran the simulation 10,000 times, and in 65% of the simulations, Biden won, and in whatever percent of the simulations, Trump won. As I reminded my students last week, we only actually run the election once. So no matter who wins, the model is still validated, right? There's no way to falsify that kind of model, because reality only happens once. Each election is unique. Now, can we study lots of different elections and try to extract some general principles like, if you spend a lot on TV ads, seems to work better than if you spend money on radio ads or whatever it might be. Yeah, I mean, we might be able to come up with we might be able to gain some insight from using that approach, but our knowledge would be very tentative. It wouldn't be rock solid like the knowledge we get that demand curve slope down, or that voluntary exchange is mutually beneficial, and so forth. So to return to your question, I think Austrian economists believe that studying multiple business cases can be interesting. It's informative, right? It certainly lets the reader, the student, or whoever understand a lot more about particular industries. It gives you some intuitive knowledge that may be useful. But can you use a bunch of case studies to extract or induce general theoretical principles? I think the answer is no, because every case is so unique. I use cases in my teaching, but I use them kind of to illustrate some point that I want to make, rather than say, well, let's study the case with just a complete blank slate in our minds, and then say, well, what did we learn just from studying this case? I don't think cases work that way. I think, we have to bring our interpretive lens to the facts on the ground to make sense of them. Otherwise, it's just noise and it's a mess, and you can't really see any patterns without some kind of, theory to guide you.
We are talking with Peter Klein about applying Austrian economics in business. Peter is one of 6 prestigious economists who authored chapters in our free ebook, Austrian Economics and Contemporary Business Applications. In it, you'll find a range of practical applications of Austrian theory to today's business world, and it will suggest all kinds of possibilities to you. It's available for free download at e4epod.com/ebook. That's the letter E, the number 4, the letter E, pod.com/ebook. And now back to our conversation. And the other piece of that, Peter, that seems to me to be a danger is that there's a temptation to take the case studies, and you've done all of your analysis and your interpretation, and you're going to be able to use that in the future. You're going to project it in some way into the future, that what happened in the past will happen in the future. And we believe that that is not the case. Every future case is unique. As you said, reality runs the model once, then it's done with it. It goes and runs another model because the circumstances change.
You're absolutely right. As an experienced teacher, how can I put this delicately for your readers? When I'm teaching a course that I've taught many times before, one is often tempted to pull out those old notes and old materials from the last time and touch them up a little bit and recycle them for the next time. You really can't do that when you're teaching entrepreneurship or teaching business strategy if you're using cases at all, because of course the cases quickly become stale. And sometimes students will comment on their evaluations. Well, I like this course, but that one case he had us read from 2012 seems completely out of date. And I think, gosh, at my age, 2012 seems like it was just yesterday, right? But there's a constant need to refresh and update these cases because they become stale so quickly, right? There's a whole, Hunter, there's a kind of a cottage industry of people looking at classic business books like Tom Peters' book In Search of Excellence, or the books by Jim Collins like Built to Last and Good to Great. We studied 10 great companies and tried to understand what made these 10 companies so great. There's a cottage industry of people collecting data on these companies like 5 years later, 10 years later, after the book was published. Half of them are bankrupt. The other half, are at the bottom of their industry. I mean, it's very dangerous to do these, if you do a study of a great company, or for that matter, a struggling company, whatever knowledge you gain is really only useful for a very short while. And I think that illustrates the point that you're making. We can learn a lot from a case, but it's very difficult to generalize to similar situations in other industries, other countries, other market segments, or even to the same industry, country, and market segment a year down the road.
But just to draw a line under this part, Peter, to quell one criticism of the Austrian school, just explain again, we're not anti-empiricists. We have a role for data. We embrace data. It's just that we think about it in a slightly different way.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, the data have to be interpreted. And this is true in real science, hard science, just as much as it's true in social science. The empirical data, whether qualitative or quantitative, are useful inputs into entrepreneurial decision making. They just don't make the decisions alone, right? The data don't give you an answer. The data don't speak. The data don't think, act, or choose. Only human beings do that. So we use the data, but the data are always subject to our interpretation. Which data do we think are more relevant, right? What message is this trend or this forecast or this, analytical model? What is the message that it's giving to me? Is that message reliable? How should I act upon that message? That's something that goes beyond the data alone. But of course, hey, a skilled Austrian economist or a skilled entrepreneur is very sensitive to the facts of reality, the facts on the ground, trying to get an edge from having a deeper, more solid understanding of the data. But again, we always have to interpret the data to make the data useful.
Which brings us to another point. You've mentioned the word theory, Peter, and another Peter Drucker, who was a great business guru, was critical of management in their refusal to use theory to guide practice or develop theory even in the first place. And you and I have looked at Professor Teppo Fallin's material on Value Lab, and he says that the value of theory is telling entrepreneurs where to look, which I thought was a nice line. If you have a theory about something specific, then that's the place to start in developing your practice through experiment. So please give us a point of view from your perspective about the value of theory to business management.
Oh, I certainly agree with Peter Drucker on this point. If I can be permitted just to tell a personal story,
Please.
When I was new to this business, when I first started out as a professor, I mostly taught introductory undergraduate classes, and I did a little bit of work with graduate students, but it was mostly working with academics or young students. And then once I had a little bit more experience, I began doing things like executive education. And I was very nervous at first talking to experienced executives in a particular company, thinking, first of all, what am I going to, what can I bring to the table that will be useful to them? And gosh, do I need to be more practical and not talk so much about theory and so forth? And a wise mentor of mine who had many years of experience in executive teaching, he said, "You've got it completely backward." He said, these experienced managers, they know everything about their industry. They know every detail far beyond what you will ever know. But what they are craving is theory. They want some general knowledge. They want some perspectives, some frameworks, some models, if you like, that will help them to see, the forest and not just the trees. So I think theory is extremely useful for business practice. Again, without theory, all we have is kind of a jumble of materials, documents. We have these cases and so forth, but we don't, we can't really summarize and articulate any general lessons that we got from all that, that mess of data. The economist Ronald Coase, who was not a member of the Austrian school, not part of the Austrian tradition, but a very wise economist in many ways, he had a great line about another group of economists that he was criticizing, the so-called institutionalist school. And I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but he said something like, they spent all of their time collecting documents and doing interviews and gathering data, but they were completely opposed to general theory, these institutionalist economists. And when asked about their legacy, he said, without a theory, they all they had was a mess of materials waiting for a theory or a fire. In other words, they collected all these papers, just waiting for all the papers to burn down because there was nothing useful that you could get out of just studying this kind of mess of documents. So I think Drucker is right that business people need theory. They need theory to provide guidance. They need frameworks or lenses for interpreting all of the messy data that they find around them. And of course, one of the great things about the Austrian tradition in economics, in contrast to some other traditions in economics, is the emphasis that's placed on theory, right? Theory doesn't give the final answer for how an actor should behave in a particular case. You need theory and some experience. You need theory and some judgment. But without the theory, we really don't have any guidance. We just have a mess. So I'm 100% in favor of using, useful and actionable theories in business teaching and in business practice.
Usable, actionable, and testable, right? Because as you said before, we look at the results and we can match them to the theory and see if we have to make any adjustments.
Yeah, I would say, if we're using theory loosely in the way that Teppo Filin does, for example, that the entrepreneur has some kind of set of beliefs about whether his product or her product will sell and how the market will work. If we want to call that a theory in this sense, then you're right, that theory has to constantly be tested against reality in the sort of beliefs, actions, results model. There's another use of the word theory that's more narrow, the way that the great Austrian economists like Mises, for example, would use very simple statements, general statements, the law of demand, or the idea that we should consider marginal benefits and marginal costs in making decisions. Those theories aren't testable in the same way as like a business model might be testable. But overall, I completely agree. It's this interaction between our theoretical knowledge and our theoretical views and what we observe around us. It's in that sweet spot that successful entrepreneurial action emerges.
Well, perhaps another way of using the word testable, I wasn't very clear, is you take a principle or a theory like consumer sovereignty, which we have developed very completely within Austrian economics, and then you ask how a company can actually apply that. It's a tremendous challenge to create an organization where the customer's in first place and they actually do determine the decisions about what's produced and what's successful and so on like that. It's a theory that you can run a company like that, but it's really hard to do. And so I think you keep trying and you keep implementing in different ways until you get better and better and better.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The abstract principle of consumer sovereignty tells us that consumers make the ultimate judgments about whether to consume or not. I, as a producer, I cannot push my product on the consumer, require the consumer to buy it. But just knowing that by itself doesn't tell me whether this specific product will be welcomed by this specific group of consumers, in this market at this time. That's the question to which I have to apply judgment by looking at the data and so forth. Or to put it another way, we know that other things equal, an increase in the price of a good or service will result in a reduction in the quantity of that good or service demanded. That's great, but if all I know is that doesn't give me much guidance as to how to price my toothpaste, right? That doesn't give me a number. I've got to get that number maybe through trial and error, maybe through some sort of intuitive understanding, maybe by looking at market trends, maybe by imitating other firms or whatever. So you have to have the principle, the general principle in mind to be able to understand what's going on. But the general principle by itself doesn't give you the exact magnitude or doesn't tell you exactly how it applies in a particular case.
Right. Yeah, we're struggling with that on a project using the idea or the theory that pricing is a discovery process. Exactly how you discover it is a real challenge. But
some of these things sound easier in principle than they are in practice, and that's why being a successful entrepreneur is not easy. And that's why experienced entrepreneurs, experienced investors often outperform those with less experience, because it is hard. And sometimes you got to go through, you got to learn not only in business school, but at the school of hard knocks, as they say.
Right. Well, let's wrap it up there, Peter. We're very excited about this ongoing project of applying Austrian economics and its theories to business. You're a great practitioner of that. We actually have some video of you speaking at the Mises Institute Supporters Summit on that very subject. We might be able to link to it on our key takeaways page. But thank you for today, and thank you for your ongoing help and energy and inspiration behind this project. And we're about to learn whether it actually helps entrepreneurs as we launch our Economics for Business platform. So,
yes, my great pleasure, Hunter. And I want to thank you for your leadership in this project. This podcast is just one part of this very ambitious project to bring ideas from the Austrian school and ideas from business and entrepreneurial practice together. And I'm really excited to see where it's going to go from here.
We all are. So again, thank you.
Thank you.
Economics for Entrepreneurs is a production of the Mises Institute. To explore more content like this, visit Mises.org. That's MISES.org. For more from Hunter Hastings, check out hunterhastings.com.